The Labours of Pevensey House by Elowen Greaves. Read by Wilbur Friesman-Durst. The coach made slow work of the final mile, its wheels protesting as they dipped into every rut of the unkept country lane. The hedgerows had narrowed oppressively, closing like hesitant hands around the narrow path, and the late autumn sky had sunk into a dull pewter above them. "It isn't much further now, I believe," said the gentleman seated opposite me. His voice was mild, but his eyes flicked toward the narrowing branches overhead with faint discomfort. "You are come to oversee the works, then?" I nodded. "Yes. Pevensey House is to be spared the full indignity of demolition, though only narrowly." The man gave a small, sympathetic smile. "They had nearly pulled it down last winter, I heard. It's fortunate the society intervened." "It is," I replied, adjusting my spectacles and glancing out the window at the fields blurring past. "There are too few such structures remaining from its period. I would not have left my post at Cambridge for many things, but this seemed a worthier occupation than further quarrelling over dating inscriptions." He chuckled softly. "Quite right, sir. Theoretical antiquities can only occupy a man so long. Far better to lay hands upon the thing itself." The coach lurched again as we crested a rise, and for a moment Pevensey House came into view, a pale shape crouched low upon the far slope, its many chimneys pricking the dim sky like rusted needles. The house did not sprawl, as some great country homes do. Instead, it pressed inward upon itself, the angles sharp, the additions of later centuries tangled together like ivy choking a tree too long left untended. "You'll find it changed little since its ceiling," my companion remarked, following my gaze. "Even the locals scarcely approach it." "Superstition, I imagine," I said, though my tone was lighter than my growing sense of unease. He gave no answer. The remainder of the ride passed in silence. At last, the coachman drew us to a halt before the front portico, where moss-furred stones bordered the drive and ivy clutched the house's pale facade like skeletal fingers. The windows reflected nothing of the low sky. As I stepped down from the coach, the first breath of the house reached me, dry, faintly sour, like books left too long beneath damp canvas. Pevensey House had been waiting. The steward met me beneath the portico, a tall, angular man whose name I recalled from the letters, Mr. Falcom. His coat was neatly pressed, though its cut was of an earlier decade, and his gloves bore the polished smoothness of long use. "Mr. Ellicott," he greeted with a faint nod. "Welcome to Pevensey House." "Mr. Falcom," I returned, offering my hand, which he accepted briefly and without enthusiasm. "I trust all is prepared for the initial survey." "As well as it can be, sir," he said. "We have done what clearing was necessary to make the principal rooms accessible. Certain wings remain sealed pending your instruction. The structural assessors are due in 3 days. Until then, you will have privacy for your examinations." "Excellent," I replied, though I could not help but glance toward the great oaken doors, their surfaces warped subtly inward as though reluctant to allow us entry. He noted my gaze but said nothing. Inside, the air thickened immediately, cool and unmoving. The entrance hall was wide but oddly compressed by heavy paneling and a ceiling that seemed too low for the breadth of the chamber. Dust softened every edge, dulling the sharp corners of the dark wood, and leaving faint trails where recent passage had disturbed the film. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects peering down with the dull-eyed vacancy that old varnish lends to old faces. I followed Falcom along the corridor, our footsteps muted against ancient flagstones. "The house has seen little human presence these last 2 decades, he remarked quietly. "The previous owners departed abruptly after certain difficulties. The property passed through several hands before the society secured it." Difficulties? I prompted. Falcom's lips pressed together for a moment. The official record cites inheritance disputes. There were also, less formal, accounts of disturbances, odd noises, unpleasant dreams, the usual village stories. He spoke with studied indifference, but there was a stiffness to his tone that suggested the matter was not entirely distant to him. We passed through a drawing-room where sheets still draped the remaining furniture like slumped, uneasy figures. Beyond it, a narrower hall led to the central stair, a broad, curving ascent that disappeared into the shadowed upper stories. "The older portions of the house lie above," Falcom said. "The rear wings were added in the last century. Those you may find less interesting." We paused before a set of heavy double doors. Falcom produced a ring of keys from his coat, selected one without hesitation, and turned it smoothly in the lock. The door groaned inward, revealing a long gallery dimly lit by narrow, high windows, their panes clouded with age. Cabinets lined one wall, glass-fronted, many of them still covered with tattered linen. "This was the family's private collection," Falcom said. "Some of the items have been removed, but much remains untouched. You'll find your work well begun here, sir." I stepped inside. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic tang beneath the expected must of paper and polish. Falcom lingered in the doorway as though reluctant to cross the threshold. "I shall leave you to your inspection," he said softly. "You know where to find me, should you require assistance." And with a slight bow he withdrew, his footfalls fading along the hall. I was alone with the house. The hush of the gallery settled thickly around me, its stillness broken only by the faint creak of the settling timbers above. I moved slowly along the cases, drawing back the coverings one by one. Beneath them lay a scattered assembly of objects, small carved figures, fragments of pottery, bundles of discoloured papers, and curiosities of uncertain provenance. Some were properly catalogued, bearing the neat hand of past inventories. Others were unmarked, left resting in their glass prisons as though awaiting judgment that never came. A peculiar unease threaded through the room, not overt, but steady as though the space were watchful. At one cabinet, my fingers hesitated over a particularly narrow drawer. Sliding it open revealed a bundle of yellowed vellum tied with faded green ribbon. The handwriting was fine but hurried, the ink browned to near transparency. An account of certain labours undertaken at the house the year of our Lord 1721. The pages that followed were written in a hand increasingly unsteady, records of repairs, of sections of the house opened and then closed again, of interventions made at the instruction of unnamed benefactors. One phrase recurred with unsettling regularity: "to relieve the strain that gathers." I frowned. The language was imprecise, oddly abstract for what ought to have been a builder's record. Strain of what nature? The walls, the foundations, or something less physical? A sudden chill whispered along my spine as a draught brushed the back of my neck, though the gallery's windows remained tightly latched. I looked up. At the far end of the gallery, one of the linen coverings had slipped partially from its cabinet, exposing the upper edge of a tall panel. The fabric quivered faintly, though no breeze was felt. Crossing the length of the room, I grasped the fabric and pulled it fully aside. Behind the glass stood a wooden relief panel, taller than myself, its surface carved in extraordinary detail. The scene it depicted was unlike any familiar biblical or classical motif. Figures writhed within cramped architectural spaces, their bodies twisted unnaturally, their arms burdened with implements whose purpose I could not immediately discern, wheels, yokes, great capstans turned by teams of straining men and beasts alike. Their faces were neither screaming nor at peace, but locked in some strange tension, expressions not of torment but of unbearable endurance. Above them, strange arc-like patterns crossed one another in ways that defied easy geometry. Beneath the tableau ran a simple inscription, Laborat donec laxitur. I whispered the translation aloud. He labors until it is released. A soft sound stirred behind me, the faintest shuffle of movement. I turned sharply, but the galleries stood empty. Only the house remained, and its waiting. The sound had come from somewhere beyond the gallery, from one of the passageways that branched off into the deeper portions of the house. I stood still for a moment listening. The hush returned thick and absolute. Only the steady tick of my pocket watch assured me that time continued to move forward. I shook off the chill that clung to my thoughts and forced myself back to the panel, studying its surface anew. The craftsmanship was masterful, but the design gnawed at my sense of proportion. The angles of the machines, the placement of the beams and wheels seemed deliberately impossible, as though they followed some rule foreign to our geometry. And the figures, though human in form, possessed no clear identity. Their faces were individualized but vacant, not anonymous, but emptied, as if the labor itself had drawn all character from them. This was not simply a depiction of toil, it was a representation of a task without end, one carried out not for any earthly reward, but to maintain some delicate balance whose nature the carver had not dared, or had not been permitted, to record directly. The phrase beneath the panel circled through my mind again, until it is released. Released from what? From labor, or from its burden? And what would follow such a release? As I traced the fine carving with my gloved fingertips, a low, muffled creak sounded once more, this time unmistakably from the floorboards at the far end of the gallery. I turned, my eyes narrowing into the dimmer portion of the hall. The doorway there stood open a fraction, only a crack wide, but where earlier it had surely been closed. I could see nothing beyond it but a narrow stripe of darkness. I waited, but no further sound emerged. At last, I crossed the gallery, my footsteps deliberate, my heart thudding with a restrained unease I could not wholly dismiss. The door itself was of heavy oak, warped slightly on its hinges. The faint smell of damp plaster and cold stone drifted from the gap. I pushed it open slowly. Beyond lay a narrow stair spiraling downwards, cut sharply into the house's foundations. The stone steps were older than those I had seen elsewhere, older even than the panel's carvings, if my instincts were correct. They descended at a steep angle into darkness, unlit and close. I had been assured that only the upper portions of Pevensey were accessible. Yet here was a portion the stewards had not mentioned, and it waited now, open before me. I hesitated at the threshold. The draught rising from below was cold and dry, touched faintly with the smell of stone, long sealed from air. There was no immediate sense of danger, no wild chill or forbidding moan, but rather something quieter, more unsettling, the unmistakable sense that this stair was not intended for visitors. No lamp hung near, and my bull's-eye pocket lantern was still packed among my effects. But after a moment's deliberation, I withdrew a small wax vesta from my coat and struck it to life. The flame burned small and uncertain in the heavy air, but gave enough light to glimpse the first few feet of descent. The walls were stone, laid with an uneven hand, their surfaces pitted and veined with old moisture marks. The stair wound tightly, far narrower than any servant's access or cellar descent had reason to be. I descended carefully, one hand trailing along the cool, rough wall to steady myself as I moved. The steps turned tightly, closing me off from the light above within moments. The flame flickered nervously at each faint shift of air, casting broken shadows that moved like thin arms along the stone. The farther I went, the more I became aware of a distant sound, so faint at first that I mistook it for the beat of my own pulse. A dull, rhythmic knocking far below, too steady for dripping water, too regular for the idle creaks of old timbers. The stair opened at last into a low chamber, its walls sloping inward like the inside of some great inverted bowl. The room was larger than I had expected, some 15 feet across, and remarkably free of debris or collapse. At its center stood a curious arrangement of wooden beams and metal braces, blackened with age, but intact. Chains of heavy iron stretched between the beams, affixed to great weights sunk partly into the stone floor. The whole construction resembled some hybrid of well mechanism and yoke, but for no purpose I could immediately identify. Beneath my feet, the rhythmic knock continued. Not within the walls, but through the floor itself, pulsing upward with a steady insistence. It was not violent, not loud, but it was purposeful, measured. And as I circled slowly around the mechanism, I caught sight of carvings faintly etched into the stone bordering its base. They matched the style of the panel upstairs, those same strange figures straining at wheels, bearing burdens, their faces turned toward an unseen weight. Beneath the carvings ran another inscription, harder to read for the wear of time. Retinetur donec solvantur. I whispered the words aloud. It is restrained until they are freed. The knock sounded again beneath my feet. Not echoing, but answering. The knock pulsed again beneath the stone, deliberate even. I could feel its rhythm through the soles of my boots, as though something far below labored still, its exertion rising faintly into the hollow chamber above. I crouched, holding a newly struck vesta close to the carvings. The flame trembled, its smoke curling upward into the stagnant air. The figures depicted in the stone seemed to writhe subtly in the shifting light. Not from any trick of carving, but from the irregular breath of my flame casting uneasy motion upon their strained postures. The mechanism at the chamber's center dominated my thoughts. Its design defied any simple classification. Not a press, nor a hoist, nor any device for drawing water or raising stone. The beams were too angular, the weights suspended at too many cross directions, as though designed not to perform work, but to oppose something, as if it braced against a strain rising from below. The labor was not being done above. The labor was contained. The knocking ceased abruptly, leaving a silence that rang louder than the sound itself had. A cool breath of air moved faintly through the chamber then, though from where I could not determine. I straightened slowly, the hairs along my forearms lifting against my better sense. A low, scraping sound echoed distantly down the stair behind me, no louder than a dragged boot across stone. I turned sharply, lifting the vesta match high toward the dark of the ascending stair. Nothing. No movement met my gaze. But as the flame guttered, I caught a glimpse of something on the lower steps that I had not noticed upon entering. Small indentations warned faintly into the stone, as though many burdens had been hauled downward over countless years. Not footprints, not human, grooves, channels worn not by feet but by chains drawn endlessly across stone. And then the match expired between my fingers, leaving me in a dense, palpable darkness. I stood very still. The knocking resumed, but now higher, closer, no longer beneath my boots, but within the very air of the chamber itself, soft, patient, inevitable. For several long seconds I dared not move. The knocking continued, calm and unhurried, as if marking my breath, as if matching the slow thrum of my heartbeat. It was not threatening. It was simply there, indifferent to my presence, but entirely aware of it. When I at last gathered the nerve to strike another match, the sudden flare of light felt almost blinding after the depth of the dark. The chamber appeared unchanged, The beams still held their tension, the chains stretched, the carved figures frozen in their unending labor. Yet the sense of containment, of something beneath the surface, pressing upward, had sharpened. I circled the device again, noting small details that had escaped me before. Faint wear upon the iron rings, old scratches along the stone where something heavy had shifted, perhaps centuries before. This was not a mechanism abandoned incomplete. It had been maintained, adjusted, corrected. The generations who had lived above had not merely forgotten this chamber. They had served it. As I studied the chains, my eyes were drawn to a narrow seam running along the perimeter of the floor, almost imperceptible but continuous. The central stone disc was not fixed. It was a lid. Whatever strained beneath labored still, its confinement precariously maintained by the weights and counterweights rigged above. The purpose of the labors was becoming horribly clear. I whispered the phrase from the panel upstairs. Laborat donec laxatur. He labors until it is released. And from the inscription here, it is restrained until they are freed. It was not he who was restrained. It was they. I do not know how long I stood frozen before the mechanism, long enough that the match burned low and singed my fingers, forcing me to drop it. The moment the flame died, the knocking ceased. The silence that followed was different than before. Not waiting, not withholding. Finished. Some subtle pressure in the air, not loud, not even physical, shifted as if some unknown calculation had just balanced. I turned toward the stair, knowing instinctively that to remain was to risk something I did not fully comprehend. But before I reached the first step, the scraping sound returned above me. This time, it was not distant. There was movement descending toward me. I froze. The sound of descent was unmistakable now, soft, deliberate steps pressing against the stone above, descending the spiral one careful pace at a time, not hurried, not clumsy, patient. The narrowness of the stair offered no refuge. Whatever came would soon fill the passage. For an instant I considered extinguishing my remaining matches and surrendering to darkness, hoping that sightlessness might grant invisibility. But some instinct warned me that to hide would be meaningless. I was not unknown to this place. I struck another match, the flare snapping into being with a sharp hiss, its glow threw the stone passage ahead into brief relief. The steps continued their approach. And then, as the flame steadied, a figure appeared at the curve of the stair above, half lit, its outline sharp and wrong in the flickering glow. It was human in shape, or had been. Its limbs were elongated slightly, its posture stooped beneath the low arch, as though it had grown accustomed to passageways narrower than any meant for a man. Draped loosely in remnants of fabric so ancient that its color could no longer be named, the figure moved with unsettling smoothness, its feet placing themselves silently upon the worn stone. Around its shoulders hung lengths of chain, not wrapped but trailing lightly behind it, their motion perfectly synchronized to its steps, as though the weight of them was neither burdensome nor accidental. Its face was veiled, not by cloth but by something akin to a thin mask, smooth and featureless except for faint, shallow grooves that curved downward like forgotten script. Where eyes should have been, only pale indentations caught the glow of my flame. The knocking, I now understood, had not come from the floor, but rather it had come from them. This was one of the laborers, neither fully alive nor fully dead, but bound to the task carved in the panel above, tasked not to break free, but to maintain the restraint, to sustain whatever lay beneath. The figure paused as my match guttered, tilting its head slightly in acknowledgment of my presence, but it neither advanced nor withdrew. It had not come for me. It had come for the mechanism. As the flame faltered once more, I took the moment granted to turn and retreat. My ascent was hurried, but not panicked. I sensed that running would serve no purpose. The labourers had no quarrel with me so long as I interfered with nothing. Behind me, I heard the faint rasp of chain sliding across stone, followed by the slow, deliberate creak of the great weights adjusting. The labour continued. The restraint remained, and I, unchallenged, was permitted to leave. When at last I emerged into the gallery, the air struck me with unnatural warmth, as though I had risen from a deep cellar into the breath of spring. My chest heaved involuntarily, though I had not realized I'd been holding my breath. The house was silent, not in that dreadful, expectant way of the lower chamber, but in the simple quiet of long abandonment. The faint ticking of my pocket watch, now resumed, sounded almost cheerful. I paused before the wooden relief once more. In the matchlight, its intricate carving seemed somehow softer now, its impossible wheels and twisted figures less straining, more resigned, as if their labours had, for the moment, returned to balance. The phrase beneath, "He labours until it is released," struck me now with sharper meaning. It was not a warning of something to come, but a statement of what always is. Pevensey House did not imprison some forgotten evil waiting to be unleashed. It was a machine, a mechanism of balance. The labourers, whether flesh or shade, were its maintenance. Their endless work preserved the house, the land, perhaps more than that. I do not flatter myself that I comprehended fully what I witnessed. The structures of that place, both visible and hidden, followed principles I could scarcely sketch, much less explain. But I knew enough to understand that interference, however well-intentioned, would be catastrophic. When I returned to the main hall, I found Mr. Falcom waiting, his expression unchanged, as though he had been standing there for some time. "You found the collection satisfactory, sir?" he asked softly. "It is instructive," I said, my voice more hoarse than I expected. He nodded faintly. "There is little need to extend your stay further, if I may say. The Society has what it requires for its records. The remainder should stay undisturbed." I held his gaze for a long moment. There was nothing of menace in his tone, only the quiet assurance of a man performing duties long inherited. "Yes," I agreed, "the house is best left to its labours."